Well, thank you so much for sticking with us until the end of the summit to hear from some of these wonderful guests that we have. And I think we will have an opportunity to tie together some of the threads that have come up across this conference about, how do we imagine a paradigm change and what really is a true alternative, not just to incarceration, but maybe even to punishment. And so with that in mind, on the panel we have Lindsay LaSalle. Lindsay is the Director of Public Health Law and Policy with Drug Policy Alliance's Office of Legal Affairs, and an expert and strategist in the areas of harm reduction and treatment as it relates to drug policy. Lindsay has been widely published, testified before numerous legislative and government bodies, including the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and is often cited in national media. In the center, we have Michael Jacobson, who's the Executive Director of the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. Prior to joining CUNY in May 2013 to help create the Institute for State and Local Governance, he was the president of the Vera Institute of Justice. He also authored Downsizing Prisons, How to Reduce Crime and End Mass Incarceration, and in addition to his accomplished academic career, spent more than 20 years in government service, including as New York City Correction Commissioner and the New York City Probation Commissioner. And it's a privilege to have you here today. And also with us, we have Rebecca Shaeffer, who's the Senior Legal and Policy Officer for Fair Trials. She's a member of the Pennsylvania Bar, has a JD from Georgetown, and has worked in many countries, including Ecuador, Guatemala, South Africa, Zambia, and Egypt. Before joining Fair Trials, she worked as a defense investigator and research fellow at Human Rights Watch, and she recently offered a really important report on the rise of plea bargaining in Europe. And she and Fair Trials bring a fascinating breadth of comparative legal experience to any conversation. And so just in framing this panel, I think it's helpful to mention what FJP does, that we work with this inspiring new generation of reform-minded district attorneys to help them translate their goals of reducing the footprint of the justice system, improving community well-being, reducing racial disparities into policy. And at the core of our approach is connecting those prosecutors to leading experts in the latest research, and also exposing them not just to promising alternative to incarceration programs, but entire models of the justice system that challenge the prison and sometimes punishment paradigm. And we and other organizations like Columbia Justice Lab and the Vera Institute have found that the best way to see that paradigm shift is often just to look beyond US borders. So this fall, we visited Vancouver and Toronto to see how Canada is making public health and harm reduction approaches, rather than law enforcement responses, the starting place for addressing the overdose crisis. So DAs from across the US visited supervised consumption sites, as well as housing and social service providers, explored the benefits of voluntary treatment models, met with police, and listened to the perspectives of people who use drugs. To expand on that learning, we traveled to Portugal with a group of DAs this May. Portugal decriminalized the personal possession and use of all drugs in 2001 and made effective harm reduction services universally accessible, and overdose deaths subsequently decreased by over 80%. And Portugal's rate of drug-related deaths is now well below the European average. A few weeks ago, we also traveled with DAs to Germany, where, as you heard from others, respect for human dignity is at the core of their correctional philosophy, and that plays out in an emphasis on deflection and diversion, and for the small fraction of people who end up incarcerated, at a rate 13 times lower than the US, remarkably more humane prisons. And all of those trips were made possible by the experts on this panel, as well as Vinny Schiraldi, who you heard from earlier. And to frame this panel in the limited time we have, we can't really dive deep into those models themselves, but we can talk about how to learn from them, how to take away key lessons for leaders, and how to overcome some of the challenges in translating international lessons to the US landscape. So as illustration, there's 3 ways that international models have informed FJP's work and the work of prosecutors around the country. For one, they offer sometimes directly transferable practices. For example, prosecutors who went on the trip with us are already moving some drug cases out of the justice system altogether, pushing to raise the age, advocating for more humane conditions of confinement, and exploring how to lower sentences. No system is perfect, so sometimes it's helpful to pull out specific innovations. And two, these models offer philosophical inspiration. For instance, even if in some jurisdictions we can't build an open prison today, we can embrace the principle of normalization, the idea that to improve reentry, life within prisons should be as similar to life outside. And three, these models offer hope, which is so vital for sustaining change in the face of skepticism and hostility. In terms of incarceration rates, we are the extreme outlier, and that's a wake-up call, but also means that it's so possible to do better. And other nations' stories of transformation can also inspire ours. As you heard, Germany's deep commitment to protecting human dignity arose because of their moral reckoning with the Holocaust, not despite it. And that's a powerful reminder of how our own reckoning with our history of atrocity and white supremacy isn't a burden we carry on the road to reform, but instead can be something that illuminates the path to justice. And so I've asked the panelists to offer similar reflections about how international models inform their own work and the work of their organizations, and some key lessons and ways to overcome challenges. Lindsay?
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for sticking around for this last panel. My name is Lindsay LaSalle. I am with the Drug Policy Alliance. The Drug Policy Alliance is a national nonprofit organization that works to change our failed drug laws at the local, state, and national levels, primarily through public education, legislative reform, and ballot initiatives. We work to advance equitable marijuana legalization, broader criminal justice reform, and harm reduction and treatment interventions. We approach this work with a racial justice lens, recognizing the racist origins of the war on drugs and the continued disproportionate impact on communities of color. We also approach this work with a public health lens, recognizing that while most people who use drugs do not use drugs problematically, for those people that do, we need a health-oriented approach and health-oriented solutions. So ultimately, we are working on two ends, two fronts. We are working to reduce the harms both of drug prohibition and to reduce the harms of drug use itself. So over the years, we have advanced a number of incremental criminal justice reforms that have provided alternatives to incarceration. The topic of this summit, including in 2000, Proposition 36, a voter-passed initiative in California that was really revolutionary at the time, that offered treatment instead of incarceration to low-level drug offenders. Since then, we've worked on scores of other sentencing reforms, including reforming the Rockefeller drug laws in New York, mandatory minimums in other states, the Fair Sentencing Act. And I think we have done a pretty good job collectively as advocates and the people in this room in advancing those alternatives. But the fact remains that 1.6 million people each year are arrested for a drug crime. 85% of those arrests are for drug possession alone. 500,000 people, 500,000 people, are incarcerated in jails and prisons for nonviolent drug crimes. So you have over 1 million more arrests than you do people incarcerated, which on the one hand would make you say, hey, we're doing a pretty good job. People aren't in jails and prisons. But on the other hand, why are we arresting over 1 million people for something that we don't ultimately think they should spend time incarcerated for, or for which we don't have enough evidence to actually charge or convict them? An arrest itself is devastating in terms of the record that follows you around from that arrest, in terms of, even as someone mentioned previously, a minimal amount of time incarceration while you're waiting to see if you're going to be charged. You can lose your job, you can lose your housing, it can be a reason to take your kids away. So the collateral consequences, not just of incarceration, but of this broader criminalization, are really, really profound. And so on this last panel, I would like to challenge us to think broader in terms of not just alternatives to incarceration, but alternatives to criminalization, and really vision what a public health approach to drug use would look like that's not premised on sanctions, that's not premised on punishment, that's not premised on kind of this proverbial stick and the need for it in order to address substance use disorder and related harms. And so I'll take one example, mostly because the vast majority of the room has left, so I feel comfortable doing it. Let's look at drug courts, right? Drug courts can be an alternative to incarceration. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes people actually end up spending significantly more time in jail than they otherwise would have because of the various sanctions that pile up. But it can be an alternative to incarceration. It is not an alternative to criminalization. It is still fundamentally premised on criminal justice involvement. I don't know of any other chronic relapsing health condition that is adjudicated and managed by police, prosecutors, and judges, be it diabetes or hypertension. That is not the way we approach other health conditions in this country, and yet we are comfortable and complacent in doing it when it comes to substance use disorder. So I would challenge us to kind of move beyond the framing of alternatives to incarceration, and that's where I think these international models can be really helpful in helping us do that visioning and help us understand that if we took this money, this investment in the criminal justice system, which has now kind of co-opted treatment, all of the treatment dollars go there, and instead reinvest those into the community, reinvest those into programs, what does that look like? So if we look at Portugal, for instance, as Liz mentioned, decriminalized the personal use and possession of drugs in 2001. This means that people are no longer arrested for being in possession of small amounts of drugs. Instead, they are issued a citation. They appear before what is called a dissuasion committee, which is made up primarily of health professionals, social workers, psychologists, and the like. This body operates completely independently from the criminal justice system. They act sort of like an arbitration body, and they have the ability to make assessments. Oftentimes people appear before them and absolutely nothing is done because they make the determination that there is no problematic drug use, there is no substance use disorder. They may have been, using publicly in the streets for which they get a warning, perhaps a small fine. If they do make a determination that the person has a substance use disorder and is in need of further treatment, then they can refer that person to voluntary treatment. And this is the big distinction here because Portugal made a commitment that they were not going to arrest anyone for failing to go to treatment, for failing a drug test, or for continuing to use the substance. So it is a model that is premised on the notion of harm reduction. It is premised on the notion that abstinence is not the only form of success, and it works with the individual at their level to provide them the services that they need. Now, the criminal justice reforms, the actual removal of the criminal penalties, was coupled with an investment into social services, into the public health infrastructure, such that people could actually access treatment in their community on demand. The criminal justice system, the police, the prosecutors, they were no longer the gatekeepers of treatment. They could go into a community clinic. They could talk to their primary care physician because it was no longer criminalized. They didn't have fear about being open about their addiction and about the services that they needed. Wide-scale access to methadone and buprenorphine, wide-scale access to harm reduction services like syringe access programs. Some of the results Liz already mentioned, drastic reduction in overdose deaths. Even more drastic reduction, a 93% reduction in the transmission of HIV and AIDS between 2001, when it started, and 2011. 80% decrease in overdose, substantially lower overdose rate than the rest of the European Union. A 60% decrease in arrests and referrals to criminal court for drug use and possession, for drug crimes more broadly. Simultaneously, a 60% increase into treatment. These are all in about the 10-year period from 2001 when it started to about 2010. At the same time, all of the fears, the irrational fears about what would happen if they decriminalized, did not come to pass. Drug use did not increase. In fact, it stayed the same, and it remains substantially lower, actually, than the European Union and far lower than the United States. So the public health impacts, those speak for themselves. Certainly in the context of the United States, where we have a different history, where we have embedded structural racism, we can expect that the benefits would extend far beyond that, to include helping alleviate. It's not going to remediate entirely, right? But it will help alleviate some of the gross racial disparities that we see in our system. All of the collateral consequences that are associated with the conviction, of course, the reinvestment of dollars into the community, into services that people can access when they need them and when they want them. Really critical. There are other countries that have stopped short of decriminalization, but have still worked, even within the current system, to build up a public health approach to drug use. And one particular intervention that I'll talk about in the context of drug policy are supervised consumption sites, also known as drug consumption rooms, overdose prevention centers, safe injection sites. They're all essentially the same thing. They are legally sanctioned facilities where people can bring in their own pre-obtained drugs to use under the supervision of medical or other trained professionals for the purposes of reducing harm. These sites are legal and operating. There's 120 of them worldwide in 12 different countries, including many in Europe, also in Canada. There have literally been, hundreds of peer-reviewed articles on the benefits of safe consumption sites. I know the representative from Washington was talking earlier about evidence doesn't matter, and unfortunately it often doesn't, and particularly when it's from different countries, but I will give it to you anyway. It has, what it does is it engages the most marginalized drug users into care and treatment. These are people who are not otherwise accessing any care. They are people who are homeless. They are people who don't have any connection to the system. And they come in and they get engaged in care. And over time, they start developing therapeutic relationships. And they might come in one time, they might come in 1,000 times. But at some point, they often transition into detox, they transition into treatment, they transition to methadone or buprenorphine. The research shows very high upticks in treatment retention. It shows reductions in overdoses, both in terms of preventing them on site. Overdoses happen all the time on site. They are always reversed immediately. Also in the surrounding areas, 35% reduction, for instance, in the Vancouver area in overdose mortality after the opening of a safe consumption site. They also reduce public order concerns around, syringe litter, loitering, nuisance, things of that nature. They actually reduce crime. They do not bring crime to the neighborhood. They actually reduce it. And it makes a lot of logical sense. People do not use more, it doesn't initiate new users, and in fact, people start to use less. And the reason is because when people know that they have a safe place to go, and they are not worried that a law enforcement officer is gonna stroll up while they are trying to inject in an alley, or a public restroom, or a public park, then they can start moderating their use. And they do, and the research proves that they moderate their use, they start using less, and they get engaged in care. We do not currently have any supervised consumption sites in the United States. That pesky criminalization rears its head again. Legislation has been introduced in 10 states to authorize it. Also moving forward at the local level, the U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia has unfortunately filed a lawsuit against a community-based organization that was planning on opening one such site, saying that it would potentially violate the federal crack house statute. So we will all keep our eyes peeled on that. Section 856 makes it illegal to have any premises where drugs are being used, essentially. So we will keep our eye on that. But there are tremendous models out there internationally in terms of how we fundamentally change this conversation to move it out of the criminal justice system entirely, not just alternatives, move it entirely out of the criminal justice system and into the public health system.
And on that, beyond even drug crimes, Perhaps, Michael, you could weigh in on, how Germany is keeping so many people out of the system altogether, and any other lessons we should be taking from there, because you helped not only with our trip, but oversaw one of your own. And so, you've thought so much about what lessons leaders should be taking from abroad.
Sure. So I think what I'll do is try to put a little bit of context on this sort of international learning thing and what it could mean sort of substantively and for sort of reform going forward. So just a little history here, because I know that these international trips have come up, and I know folks have talked about Germany here, which is, it's all a good thing. We probably did the first trip of this kind at Vera 10 years ago, give or take, and we took, I guess at the time, 40 policymakers from, I guess it was Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Colorado to see prisons in, we picked Germany and the Netherlands, and we did that for a few reasons. But really the reason we wanted to do that was both because at the time, and since then, even more so, Vera was really not just interested in issues of mass incarceration and how to downsize and how to reduce or end mass incarceration, but it was also very interested in conditions and what the experience of prison is. And certainly at the time, there were very few people doing work on that. There were almost no funders who were interested in funding it. We had an opportunity to take pretty high-level policymakers to look at conditions in other countries, and partly it was an experiment just to see what that would be like. Would it be meaningful? Would it result in any reforms back home? So we got funding to do it, and we decided on Germany and Netherlands for a bunch of reasons, mostly because I thought it would just be a bridge too far to take them to Norway and Finland. I thought it would just be too much to deal with. And so, but Germany and the Netherlands are very progressive systems and really interesting. And when we started doing it, of course, you hear, which you still hear all the time, there's so much American exceptionalism generally, certainly in the issue of criminal justice, and what are we going to learn from a bunch of small, semi-socialist, homogeneous little countries? What can they teach us? Everything is so different. Their demographics are different. They don't have the kinds of lethal violence we do. They don't have the same gang problems, on and on. And, we'd say, and mostly I would say, it's true, there are incredible differences between these systems, and you can sort of start listing them ad infinitum, but they're not just different. Those systems are better. They're not just different, right? They're better. So, I mean, I feel free to make, well, I have tenure, so really there's, so I mean, they, not surprisingly, found that incredibly annoying, but, and it, it's understandable at some level, and I should say, before we took them, and again, these groups were comprised of directors of corrections, elected prosecutors, lead defenders, chairs of corrections and fiscal committees in the legislature, governor's council. So I mean, exactly the kinds of folks who would want to see this. We quickly came to the realization that it made no sense to take them on this kind of tour, because most of those folks have never seen their own prisons. You can live in the criminal justice system forever and never, if you're a prosecutor or a judge, certainly if you're a legislator, and never see what your own systems are like. So we actually spent a few months taking them in their own states on these kind of tours, so at least they'd have some kind of sort of minimal baseline of what the comparison would be when they saw these systems. Anyway, there's not a lot of, I don't have a lot of time for detail. I'm not really going to get into the guts of what we saw, but the experiment in some ways for us is what would, and it was 10 days, 10 incredibly intensive days that we took these folks to do this. And we up at 8 in the morning, back at midnight, and we just spent all our time in prisons with the staff, with prison governors, with ministers of justice. It was incredibly intense. And just to sort of cut to the chase, in some ways, I think it's safe to say you know, by the end of the trip, I mean, for all of them, it was a life-changing experience in all the ways you would want it to be, because you can't be immersed in these systems for that long, and you know, eventually your sort of defensiveness just gets stripped away, and you really understand what people do and how they do it. And in those particular systems, I mean, they are just better than ours, and it's apparent once you're really in it. But the question, which is still an open question, is to what end, right? I think it's really is safe to say it was an incredibly meaningful experience for all of them, but what does that mean in the long run? Of what purpose is it that we sort of change their lives by doing this? And I'll answer that question a little, and just at the risk of repeating maybe a little of what you've heard. You know, I think there are 4 or 5 sort of central things that just become apparent when you're in those systems. And I should say it's important not to over-idealize those systems. You know, they have their own set of problems in both those countries around conditions. You know, disproportionate incarceration, high levels of immigrants, all that stuff. They're far from perfect, and Western Europe generally is full. And France and Italy and Spain, absolutely miserable. Prisons in the UK, sadly, is going down on the sort of atrocious American road. So it's anyhow, it's important not to take them as some sort of utopian ideals, but they're light years better than our system, which I understand is just an incredibly low bar. So a few things that you take away. I think Liz mentioned this notion of human dignity, and it's not. I think one of the things that was most made the biggest impression on these folks is that when the Americans asked, we had incredible access to the prison staff, the prison governors, the prisoners themselves, and when they asked, no matter where we were, when they asked the staff, what are your goals here? What are your operating principles? How do you go about doing your work? I mean, they'd all say, it was really pretty extraordinary. They'd literally all say in one form or another, well, for us, it's this notion of human dignity in the European Convention of Human Rights. And that was a sort of shocking thing for, our policymakers. It's not like they never heard the words human and dignity before, but not really about this particular population. But when you start to hear it again and again, you get the sense that this is very sort of serious, meaningful stuff. So that the notion of human dignity and running and working in a system that's based on human dignity is just baked in there. Again, they're not perfect, but it's just a completely different way of thinking about running prisons than we have, and you can't not be impressed by it. The systems themselves, the prisons themselves are incredibly programmed. They both have sort of forensic mental health systems, so that when someone's diagnosed early on, they're actually not in that system. They're going to another system. But the other thing that's incredibly apparent and noticeable, especially if you're a practitioner, is the staff themselves, right? It's just an incredibly different level of staff than we have in any of our, well, certainly jails, but prisons, right? It's a respected public profession. In Germany, for instance, there's a battery of tests that you have to take to become corrections staff. Most people fail those tests. For the people who pass, it's 2 years of sort of academic and practical work before you ever start your work in a prison itself, right? I mean, the level of sophistication, skill, empathy, et cetera, is just at an incredibly different level than we have, and it's amazingly noticeable and very, very sort of practical, right? So that's, for all the people who went on the tour, that's sort of obvious. There's a lot more staff in prisons than we have, right? Because the trade-off they make is that they put, and compared to our rates, they put next to no one in prison, right? You have to sort of work to get in prison in those countries. So their rates are incredibly low. But for the people who are there, they understand this. In fact, it should be an expensive operation, right? If you're going to treat people with dignity, if you're not, which they don't, heap on punishment, right? The sense is, this is part of the human dignity, right, that you don't get more punishment once you're in prison. The punishment is that you're in prison, right? It's not, once you're in, right, you're treated with respect. In Germany, you have private rooms, the doors are solid, the correctional officers have to knock, right? And, you know, Americans are totally shocked by this. But, you know, after a while, it becomes sort of less shocking, right? So all that is apparent. It all costs sort of money per capita, but they have a lot less capita, right? So their spending is next to nothing. Now, spending itself obviously does not get you there. Rikers Island is actually the most richly staffed correction institution on the planet. No place, not in Finland, not Sweden, not Norway, no one has the staff to inmate ratios that Rikers does. We have 1.4 officers for every inmate, 1.7 total staff per inmate. No one has that yet. It's a horrible place. So it's not like money alone gets you this. And this is what I want to make my sort of final point about, which is the sort of what is to be done, right? Of what good is it to do what we did? I mean, it has to be some good to do this kind of education. The challenge for folks, whatever, like me or people we work with and colleagues in the field, is how you change the culture of these institutions to operate in a completely different way than they do now. And I would argue, as hard as it is to end or reduce mass incarceration, to significantly reduce the footprint of criminal justice, as hard as that is, what I'm talking about is much harder, right? There are no easy legislative fixes here. You can't just pass a law, local or state, that says run a good prison. This is hard, on the ground, really tough work to sort of change the way you staff and think and operate these prisons. There's 3,000 jails, there's 50 prison systems. It's a hyper-local activity. So, you know, in order to get, if that's our North Star, you know, you need a strategy that's above and beyond that. They're not simple, but the strategies that we use to end mass incarceration, all those are great, and we have to do it, and we have examples all over the place of states and cities. New York is one, New Orleans is another, that have had, you know, massive declines in populations, but their systems are as terrible as they used to be, right? This is a different order, a different kind of work to do, and the challenge for reformers, and we happen to be pretty involved in this on the Rikers Island front, because while there's this move to close Rikers and open borough jails, you know, people and advocates will say, understandably, well, you don't want to just move into those jails with the same operating principles you have now, because then you'll just have a bunch of mini Rikers. It's not quite that simple, but it's still kind of true. So that the challenge is, and it still sort of remains to be seen, how you can do this in any scalable way. How do you get these systems, which people who go there, you know, there's a lot of academic literature on this, are clearly better, are clearly preferable. How does a place like Georgia, which has, you know, they have next to no officers, they're horribly trained, they're horribly paid. Georgia was one of the groups on the trip, and I'll end with this. And, you know, after that trip, they would say, I get it. You know, I get it. We, in Georgia, if you have a GED and we put you in a conference room for 2 weeks, you're on the floor of our prisons. Like, we get it. You know, this is 1,000 times better than that. But how do we do that? You know, how is it that we get from here to there? And that's a good question. I of course have an answer to that question, and I can't get into it now, but you know, this requires sort of political, fiscal, and substantive strategies that are different than just thinking about how to reduce mass incarceration. And again, I think more difficult, it's going to take more commitment, it's going to take a fairly long time, but it's incredibly important not to lose that focus, because reducing the footprint is great, but it's just not enough.
Thank you. And I know, Rebecca, that you are kind of a broader lens of trends across Europe, and part of that might even be responsive to this question of how do you impact the culture, the accountability mechanisms, the incentives that are in there to make countries organize their prison systems in different ways. And maybe that'll be a part of your answer, or maybe you have different thoughts in response to that question.
I'll try to touch on that a little bit. Right, so I'm Rebecca Shaeffer. I work at a place called Fair Trials International. We're not very well known yet in the United States. I always say we're like David Hasselhoff, huge in Germany, not so big here. I don't know. It's not even Germany that we're big in. We actually have our headquarters in London, and we have a big office in Brussels, and we work primarily on European criminal justice reform and cross-border and international procedural rights issues. And I worked in the London and Brussels offices for 6 years. As you can tell by my accent, I'm a US lawyer, worked here for a while, went there, and I went over there with a lot of the same kind of assumptions that I think people have about comparative criminal justice between the US and Europe, which is that, like, yeah, we have really bad prisons and we have really long sentences and we have like the death penalty, but procedurally, we're the best, right? And I kind of thought that too. And I had come from a criminal defense background, and I went to Europe and did a lot of training of criminal defense lawyers there. And I told them, we have the best criminal defense lawyers on earth. We have the best procedure on earth. And they said, then how come everybody's in prison there? Like, your success record is really bad. And that's right. And I think we have to start to break down our idea of ourselves as world leaders in criminal procedure. Fair Trials International does focus on criminal procedural rights, but we end up, of course, working a lot around the drivers of incarceration. And I want to talk about some stuff that's been happening in Europe that sort of draws those two together. So after working in Europe for quite a while and seeing a kind of procedural rights revolution happening there over the last decade, I became more and more fixated with coming back home. I mean, we had Ferguson happen, and Black Lives Matter movement was born all of the time. I was in Europe, and I was like, I just got to get home. I have to stop tinkering around the edges of essentially functional systems and get back home where the real fight is, and show them the way that things are done other places, because our people deserve better. My people deserve better than they're getting. So we were doing okay, the United States, for a while there in the middle of the century, right? We had like Gideon, and we had Brady, and we had Miranda, and we sort of had this like Cold War idea of ourselves as champions of the individual against the state in the area of criminal procedure, and we started exporting our models around the world through Department of State, through diplomatic efforts, DOJ, in the decades that came after. But in the decades that came after, as we were busy exporting this model of open adversarial justice and zealous defenders and independent empowered prosecutors, all free of state interference, as a real foil against the sort of Soviet inquisitorial civil statist models that we saw or we imagined in Europe, or were true about Europe for quite a while, or some parts of Europe under Soviet influence. So we were exporting our model of open adversarial justice, but at the same time, internally, what we were doing is burying ourselves, right, in the decades that came after, in mass incarceration. And we were doing it really by getting around all of our strong procedural protections that we had established in the middle part of the century through plea bargaining, right? As we know, we have like very few trials anymore. And so all of those great procedural guarantees aren't happening. And I don't think that's the whole story, but I think it's part of the story of mass incarceration. How we got here is that we stopped actually respecting our procedural rights rules. And what was happening in Europe at that time was a lot of change in their criminal procedure. They were developing hybridized systems that involved some parts of common law and also new sort of versions of civil law, and breaking free of the inquisitorial Soviet influenced systems. And they were building the European Union, an area of free movement and common standards of justice under the promise of the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights, and it worked. It's a miracle, really. It's not perfect, but it's true. It's really a political miracle. And so as people were able to move freely across borders, so crime started happening across borders. And so especially after 9/11, Europe developed all these police and judicial cooperation mechanisms, principally the European arrest warrant, which is a way to get people to justice across European borders really quickly. And they did this it all rests on the underpinning of mutual trust between EU member states. So we all trust that we all have the common standards of justice, and we trust each other. But they didn't actually trust each other, because prison conditions across EU member states are really different. And the Netherlands would say, actually, I'm not going to let a Dutch citizen go and sit in an Italian jail for 4 years in horrible conditions and not see a judge for months. So no, you don't get your guy extradited. And the European arrest warrant system started to fail a little bit. It started to fail in certain cases. So countries were like, we need to be able to prosecute our guys, right? And they started caring about all of their violations at the European Court of Human Rights for overcrowding, which was happening quite a lot in some countries. So in response to what was essentially a prisons crisis, an overcrowding crisis, first of all, what Europe did was say, we're not building new prisons. That's not how we're doing this. We're gonna drive down prison rates through improving protection of procedural rights. And that was partially because of some quirks in the Lisbon Treaty, which you don't have to care about, which means that the European Union can legislate in the area of procedural rights much more easily than it can legislate on sentencing or on prison conditions directly. So they passed the European arrest warrant. It's having problems because of lack of human rights protections because of overcrowding in prisons. And so the European Union starts to pass this raft of procedural rights protections, principally among them, just in the past decade, right of access to a lawyer upon arrest. So this was in principle a right in Europe, but practically speaking, it was difficult in a lot of places to get access to a lawyer right after arrest in the police station. The primary concern was having access to a lawyer in the police station. And if you think about it, it's kind of a problem here too, right? How many people actually see a lawyer in the police station? No, probably at arraignment, right? At best. So it's one of those things where you're well, no, we have access to a lawyer, but do we really upon arrest? So they realized that this was a practical problem, and they passed the European Union directive on the right of access to a lawyer, and now there's lawyers in all the police stations in Europe, more or less. I mean, we have some implementation problems in some places, but places like Ireland didn't allow lawyers in the police station before 2015. The Netherlands didn't allow lawyers in the police station before around 2015, 2016, and now they do. It's a sea change in procedure in the early hours after arrest. We also got the right of access to information in criminal proceedings under EU law, which means that everybody now it's like an improvement on Miranda, right? Everybody gets a letter of rights. The law says that the letter of rights has to be read out loud and given to someone on paper, has to be in their language, in their home language, and it also has to be in plain language, not in technical terms. So you have all of this experimentation happening in Europe now about what plain language is in the provision of rights. The right of access to information directive also has a provision about discovery of evidence. It says that people have to have access to all of the evidence that they need to defend against pretrial detention, because remember, the EU is trying to drive down prison rates. That's why it's doing all this. So it says, okay, if we can get less people locked up in pretrial detention, that's a good thing. Let's do it through procedural rights. Lawyers have to have access to the evidence it needs. So now you have all these new lawyers in police stations, and they have a beefed up right of access to discovery. And what they start doing is arguing that actually I need full access to the entire case file, to all the evidence that's there in the police station, because if I really want to do my job, I'm arguing that this person shouldn't be arrested at all. And I need all the evidence to be able to do that. And I need to keep you from locking them up overnight. And I need all the evidence to do that. So this has all happened in the last 5 years in Europe. I'm not sure why Europe's not talking about it more. I'm doing a lot of work for them, and I expect recognition at some point. But so there's a lot of other laws that got passed, all within the last decade, beefing up rights of procedural rights for children, for vulnerable adults, sort of codifying what the presumption of innocence means. And this is all happening at a time when we have sort of eschewed focus on procedural rights. So we're just looking to bring some of that learning to the movement in the United States. We're trying to say there are things to learn from, yes, in the prison space, and yes, in the sentencing space, and yes, about the death penalty, and we're here to help with all that too. But what we really want to talk about is procedural rights and its link to detention conditions, and mass incarceration. So we have a couple of projects. We're looking at one that's more related to sentencing. We're looking at day fines. Maybe some folks heard about that yesterday. In Germany, let's talk about Germany. I know, but it's not just Germany. It's most of the European Union countries, and actually most of Latin America too, has day fines, use fines in place of incarceration for misdemeanors, although what's considered a misdemeanor, some of it in this country would be considered a felony. So like 80% of convictions in Germany, you know, are just a fine. And 75% of those fines are paid on the spot, which tells you that they're affordable. They're affordable because they're assessed according to people's ability to pay. And so that's what we're doing, a deep dive in partnership with the Center for the Criminal Justice Policy Project at Harvard, looking at all the different methods used to assess ability to pay and the assessment of fines as punishment in Europe and in Latin America, and then what enforcement looks like for indigent people, so that we can if we're thinking about decarceration strategies in the U.S., we know that we have a unique ability to like turn anything into another route to incarceration, right? We want to make sure that if we think about fines instead of incarceration, for example, it doesn't become another route to debt poverty that we've seen. We want them to be income sensitive. Can we do it here? I don't know. There's a lot of questions that have to be answered, but we can look at a lot of different models. It's not just like Germany's really great, Norway's really great. I mean, many other countries are doing this. And so we can think about it too. So we're looking at day fines. We have a big area of work on plea bargaining. We've looked at the way that plea bargaining operates in 90 countries, and we're continuously doing more research. You want me to stop talking? Plea bargaining, I could talk about all day, but there's a sort of interesting story there. So what I want to leave you with, I have a lot more to say, but what I want to leave you with is that it's not a simple story about like they're really good in some places and we should be as good as them, right? It's a multipolar world. So we exported some good practice, which then got improved upon, changed, adapted, and now we can relearn, right? And there's some really good practice coming out of places that have some really problematic, really big problems, including the US. So also Europe is still learning from the US, and Latin America is still learning from the US, and they're learning good and bad things. So like, just wait, it's like any day they're gonna bring in algorithmic risk assessments, right, in pretrial detention space in Europe, guarantee. Are they going to bring the learning that we have now, the good and the bad, the dangers? I don't know. We're here to try to make sure that some of that learning goes with it. So I think if we just think about how complex the world is, how innovations and changes travel across borders, it's not a simple story, and we don't have to, talk about who's better and who's worse. The whole world is a laboratory, right? We have to keep up with it. We're still telling ourselves old stories about who we are and what our system is. And I think that there are new stories and new practices to learn from in multiple directions, and that we can learn from good and bad practice. So we look at day fines, the use of day fines in Europe, for example. We can say, what are the dangers? What are they doing wrong? What do we not want to bring over if we try to do something like that in the United States? So it's not just about like feeling bad about the US. Other spaces we're working in is pretrial detention. Guess what? We're trying to get rid of cash bail. Nobody else uses it. You want to find out what happens when you don't have cash bail? There's a lot of places to look. And again, you can learn from the dangers, because pretrial detention is still overused in places where there's no cash bail. So getting rid of cash bail alone is not going to fix our problems. It's going to fix one part of it. It's not going to fix the overuse of pretrial detention. And we can look at what's happening in other places to learn about good and bad practice in a non-cash bail. There's also other jurisdictions, England, Ireland, that use cash bail in a totally different way than we do. In a very small number of cases, again, graduated for income, in a very limited way. And we can learn from that too, because we're not going to get rid of cash bail everywhere in the US, and maybe we shouldn't. So plea bargaining, day fines, and this early access to a lawyer, right? Like, what does it look like to have access to a lawyer, to discovery, and to really plain language, accessible information about rights right from the point of arrest? We sort of had the hint of that promise with some of our case law a long time ago, and it's sort of fallen by the wayside, and we can renew our commitment to protection of rights in those early hours, and I think that we can learn from Europe that can have an impact on incarceration.
Thank you so much. So I think we heard that, both there's challenges in changing culture, things that take a long time and are really difficult, but also there's immediate innovations like safe consumption sites or day fines that we could turn around and try tomorrow. And so on that note, I think maybe we have time for one or two questions before we wrap up.
I just had a question for Rebecca with regard to the EU and racial disparities. If their overall objective is to reduce the prison rate, how does that impact people of color?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because one of the things we're trying to do with transatlantic learning is bring some of the racial justice lens that the criminal justice reform movement has in this country to Europe, because it's not there in the way that it needs to be. Data collection on demographic data disaggregated for ethnicity is prohibited in many European countries. It's with an equality aim, but they do it in a completely different way. We're working right now at Fair Trials on some research on discrimination against Roma defendants in 5 EU jurisdictions, and we are bringing racial justice experts from the US to speak to them, because they don't, they're struggling with how to talk about racial injustice in the criminal justice system, to document it, to identify it.
Okay.
So that's an area where I think Europe has a lot to learn from the USA. They tend to, the lens on racial justice in the criminal justice space in Europe that I'm seeing right now is couched in terms of xenophobia. It's in anti-Arab, attitudes primarily, and they'll talk about, you heard Michael talk about, oh, they don't have gangs in Europe, but what they will talk about is radicalization in the prisons, and there's a lot of anti-radicalization programming in the prisons. So I think that the desire to drive down incarceration rates is not consciously at a national level, at a political level, about racial justice, but I think that it should be, and it needs to be, and that's part of what we're trying to do.
Anyone else?
I'll just comment because I was on that trip with you. Kind of what I saw in terms of race and incarceration was that the way the system developed in Germany was it was race neutral, and so the system and the laws reflect that. And so I can't say, and we did question that whether or not it was biased, free of bias, but what I saw in the system was that it was fair and it was focused on humanity. Trying to eliminate all bias is probably impossible, but I did see their system as being fairer than ours in a lot of respects.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, and so maybe just one last question. What gives you hope about the US justice system when you look to international models as we wrap up?
I mean, what gives me hope is the movement. The movement here, there's nothing like this anywhere else. The movement for reform that we have in this country, and the way that it's rooted in affected communities, the way that it's led by affected communities, is the main message that I bring to Europe about what's possible there. And it's not replicated anywhere else. And that is absolutely the reason that it's going to be successful, because of who it's led by, the people that are most affected by our system. That's what gives me hope, that it's those communities at the forefront.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful around the sort of, whether it's through a racial justice lens or the notion of ending mass incarceration. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of sort of ferment here. This is a really interesting historical time for the U.S. There's a ton of advocacy and gains state to state on that issue. I'm less hopeful on the condition side. I mean, I still am. I wouldn't say I'm sanguine, but I think there's a path forward. Vera, some of you may know, it does some really interesting work on prison conditions, especially on solitary confinement and treating people humanely. That a number of systems, Connecticut's one, is taking up. But there's much more work to do on that front. So I think in overall we're at a really interesting time now in this country on issues of incarceration, but I tend to separate the sort of size, footprint, and massness of it from whatever the size, whenever we end mass incarceration, whatever that point is that we flip to normal incarceration, whatever that number is. I, of course, have a number, but whatever that number is, you don't want the system to look and operate like it looks now. And so there we have a fair amount of work in front of us.
I would say in terms of drug policies specifically, I think the devastating impact of the overdose crisis gives me hope in the sense that because it's so terrible, people are willing to acknowledge that there may be other ways to address this problem and that it shouldn't be rooted in criminal justice. And so localities have been willing to step out and experiment with things like trying to get supervised consumption sites off the ground or law enforcement assisted diversion, which does have some flaws, but in essence is de facto decriminalization and actually decriminalizes at much higher threshold levels than even Portugal. And so having those actors at the local level, despite state law, despite federal law, say I'm moving forward with a different path gives me hope.
Thank you all so much, and thank you to Aleph for having us.